as well as the affirmative team. The United States is considering next steps, including the removal of Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list, as part of a path to a full normalization of relations with Sudan, and a move that would undermine core United States national interests. This quote from John Prendergast, an American human rights and anti-corruption activist who was the former director of African Affairs for the National Security Council, writes on March of 2018, the impact of removing Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list, the policy proposed by the affirmative team. In today's debate round, what we as the negative team would like to be shown you is that the affirmative team fails their basic burdens of proof. These burdens of proof are known as the stock issues. What they describe are the things that the affirmative team must prove to you as the judges before your ballot is warranted. The first is that they must prove that their policy is on topic of the resolution, as they would have no how to act if they were not under the resolution. They must prove to you that there is a problem in the current system, a significant harm to U.S. interests right now. Furthermore, they must prove that the current system is insufficient to solve that on its own, that if left to its own devices, the United States could not correct for the harms that they see. And lastly, they must prove to you that their specific policy, backed up by experts, can actually solve the problem. They claim that Russian influence is going to be a problem for the United States interests. To warrant your ballot, they must prove that that can be solved by removing Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list. Now, in today's debate round, we as the negative team would like to adopt the same goal as the affirmative team, that of United States interests. When the United States acts in foreign policy, we must always keep our own interests at the forefront. However, we are already doing that in the current system. And I'll be doing this looking at a couple of the points. First of all is the significance. Is there a significant harm in the current system? And this is one of the basic burdens. However, it appears to be unfulfilled. Furthermore, I will be later discussing the issue of solvency, showing that their affirmative team's policy does not actually solve their stated harm. And lastly, I'll be looking at the disadvantage to passing their policy, the reason why the United States interests would actually be harmed by removing Sudan from the state sponsor of terrorism list. My first point is that we are already discussing normalization and removing sanctions. We are already discussing normalization and removing sanctions. Now, according to their own evidence in their 1AC from Robbie Grammer on November 8th of 2018, it writes, quote, the plan, a second phase in the normalization of Washington's relations with the country that it is blacklisted since 1993, outlines steps that Sudan must take to lift crippling sanctions that have helped bring the country to the brink of economic collapse, end quote. The main part of this is that it talks about normalization talks. Furthermore, the quote that I read at the start of my speech from John Prendergast talks about how the United States is considering this option, but ultimately he later says that that would be devastating to our interests. And I'll be discussing that a little bit later. I would also like to point out that their first fact, that they are in compliance with all of our requirements for the SSOT, to get off the SSOT list, the state sponsor of terrorism list, are met. However, this does not actually seem to be true. It is apparent that Sudan continues to sponsor terror. John Prendergast writes on February 23rd of 2018, quote, there are extremely troubling policy directions being taken by the government of Sudan that should give further pause to normalization. First, and most alarmingly, even while sharing some intelligence with the CIA, the Sudan regime has maintained extensive ties with active extremist organizations and clerics within Sudan. Some call for jihad. Others recruit or advocate for the Islamic State group or Al-Qaeda against an historical backdrop that includes being implicated and held liable for the bombings of U.S. embassies and the USS Cole, as well as hosting Osama bin Laden for years. What John Prendergast points out is that Sudan still has links to terrorism, and therefore we are not ready for normalization. Furthermore, I'd like to delve into further significance looking at the tool that they are talking about, the state sponsor of terrorism list. And I refer to it as a tool rather than a definition because it is just that. It's a political tool used for naming and shaming the countries that we deem necessary to improve. Daniel L. Vyman, a senior fellow in the Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institute, writes on April 30th of 2018, quote, just as Trump added North Korea to the list, so it is tempting to show U.S. disapproval for Russia's many hostile actions by calling it a terrorist. Russia's bombing of civilians in Syria, for example, deserves even more condemnation than it has received. Indeed, part of the purpose of the list is to name and shame bad actors with the negative attention and penalties convincing them to mend their ways, end quote. What this goes to show is that the state sponsor of terrorism list is not necessarily a factual designation. That is a political tool that the United States wields. However, you might be asking, why should we wield this against Sudan? That brings me to the solvency point, how they don't actually solve the harms presented. And that is because they will be turning to Russia no matter what. Sudan turns to Russia no matter what. One of their main harms to the United States interests was that Russia is going to step in if the United States continues on the path. However, this is not necessarily backed up by evidence. Furthermore, their Fact 3 in their own 1AC cites this. Dr. Theodore Persic and Giorgio Cafiro writes, quote, "Such thinking is in line with the views of leaders of Arab states across the ideological spectrum, who see Moscow as a force for stability and a pillar of new security landscape in the region." End quote. Furthermore, John Prendergast again reports on February 23rd of 2018 that as soon as the United States mitigated some sanctions against Sudan, they turned right to Russia. They are already normalizing relations with Russia under the current system. So the harm that the affirmative team has presented is non-unique. It will be there whether we act under the affirmative team's policy or not. They are not actually mitigating this harm to United States interests, and therefore they cannot claim that they solve their goal if their policy has no harm in Russia. Lastly, however, I'd like to look at the disadvantages. The reasons why their policy not only doesn't uphold U.S. interests, but actually works counter to them. John Prendergast, in February of 2018, writes, quote, "After removing long-standing comprehensive sanctions against the government of Sudan, the United States is considering steps on the path of full normalization of relations, driven by the U.S. intelligence community's belief that such a development towards normalization would enhance U.S.-Sudan intelligence cooperation. However, moving at this time towards normalization ignores critical developments and new circumstances that affect core U.S. national security interests." End quote. The United States would not be benefited by the affirmative team's plan. They have not shown you in the current system that there is actually a problem with Russia, or that they have not shown you, rather, that their plan can solve that harm. This will exist in both the affirmative and the negative world. That goes to show that their policy will not solve the problem. Furthermore, their policy is insignificant. The harm that they presented that Sudan is in full compliance is not necessarily true. There's no reason why Sudan actually has to be normalized. And in fact, there's much evidence to provide, as I outlined in my disadvantage, that now is not the right time. What the impact of the stock issues and the disadvantages are is that the affirmative team does not deserve it value. Because if they cannot provide a significant harm or a significant plan to solve that harm, then they are not affecting U.S. interests in any way, shape, or form. And as the disadvantage goes to show, they are only standing to harm our United States' core national interests. It is for these reasons that I would ask that you stand with national interests, that you stand with the goal of the affirmative team by sticking with the status quo, because that will actually uphold the United States' interests better than any policy the affirmative team is presenting. Thank you so much.